So again, welcome to lecture 4 of course social media at work. Today we're going to continue our lecture on computer-mediated communication, and we're going to talk about virtual teams. I posted an announcement or two announcements online over the weekend on Canvas. And the first one, which I explained that I did a bit of a switch around on the lectures. This lecture and the lecture for next week. So today we're going to talk about virtual teams, and next week about knowledge management. I also made a few changes to the lectures in order to fit everything into this and the next lecture, which also means that there is some literature that's not exam literature, but that's all explained on Canvas. Second of all, the grades for the first assignment are also available, as you may have already seen. And if you have any questions about that, you can email me and I will respond as quickly as I can. Finally, I want to say something about the exam. I got a few questions last week during the workgroup sessions about the exam. So we are planning the exam as a take-home exam, but within a specific time frame. Which means that you have 2.5 hours to finish the exam, but you can make the exam from home, and you can use whatever resources you want. So you can use all the literature and the slides, etc. Which also means the exam will not be proctored, but it's just an online exam. We will give more information about the exam in the last lecture, and we're also still trying to find out what the best way of organizing the exam is, but most likely it will just be available on Canvas, and then you have to re-upload the exam on Canvas after 2.5 hours. Yeah, it will be open book. Well, it will be open everything. So it's you make it at home. It's not proctored, so you can basically, you can hire a social scientist if you want. Well, I won't do that if I were you, but there is. It was scheduled October 18th. Oh, okay. I did not see that yet in my schedule. No, there's no communication allowed. All right. So no. So you have to make the exam on your own. We did the exam the last way last year, and you have to write 3 short essays in 2.5 hours, which is a lot. And last year, most students found the exam difficult, and they said we had no time at all for anything else but writing the exam. So students last year were quite nervous for the exam. They found it quite difficult, but they also said they really liked the exam because it doesn't test your ability to remember things, but your ability to analyze and then work with what you have learned during the course. So that's it. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So that was the words that I've been looking for. It better test your understanding and not your memory. Yes. So no chances have been made for the exam. I'm not sure if I understand you. Yeah, apart from the questions, it's the same as last year. Yeah, thanks. A sort of practice. No, there will not be a practice exam, but we may give some examples of questions in the last lecture. Oh, I'm sorry. See, is there anything else? Yeah. Okay. Isabel, are your questions answered? Okay. Okay, great. But more information on the last lecture. So it's a bit of a difficult exam, but it's really it's fun. Well, fun as far as exams can go. It's a pretty fun and interesting exam. So if there are any questions, feel free to ask, and we can discuss them during the break, for example. So for now, we're going to virtual teams, but we still have a lot to discuss from last week from CMC theories, but they are intricately related, of course, to how people communicate with each other in teams. So it's okay to discuss in one lecture. I'm going to switch to the other slide. I think there it is. So last week we did discuss that computer-mediated communication theories have been around for over 35 years, and probably even longer. Like I said, the first review I have of CMC theory is from 1975, which is almost 50 years ago. But of course, it really took off when people started using social media, or when people started communicating online, ever since the early 90s or so. But people have been, using computer-mediated communication ever since like the Second World War, and it was also already quite popular during the 80s. All the CMC theories originated from a time where most online communication was necessarily text-based. And they are still informed a lot about, based on this early idea of what computer-mediated communication is. So they all basically say that the best way of communicating is face-to-face, not all of them. And if you have less cues available than face-to-face, so if you have no sound, no images, no video, then it's always a bit more different than face-to-face interaction. The theories differ in how they deal with that lack of cues that we have in online communication. So we shortly discussed social presence theories. So those are the earliest theories we have on computer-mediated communication, and they are really based on the idea that in computer-mediated communication you have less cues available, you have less bandwidth. Bandwidth is the amount of cues you can communicate in a time frame. So for example, now you can see the screen with the slides, you can see me, you can hear me. So we have a lot of bandwidth, a lot of different cues which you communicate quickly. And if we have less bandwidth, for example, if we would use WhatsApp or email, we would only have text-based cues. It would be way slower. So computer-mediated communication lacks bandwidth. So even now, compared to face-to-face, as some of you pointed out as well during the workgroup session last Thursday, we don't have the full picture. So you cannot see me as a whole. You cannot see the hand gestures I make. So we still lack a bit of bandwidth. We still lack some cues. The theories also say, because of this lack of cues and because of this mediated interaction, the social presence also decreases. And social presence is a psychological feeling of being together with someone. So the degree of salience of the other person in the interaction and of the interpersonal relationship. So it's really the impression that you have that you're really talking to someone else near you, and not to, for example, a robot. So that's social presence. And the theories say lack of bandwidth decreases social presence. Therefore, these theories say, well, that means that text-based communication is mostly suited for task-oriented communication. If you want to make an appointment or want to schedule a virtual team meeting, it's also an appointment. But for simple communication, and they say, well, per definition, because it lacks bandwidth, it lacks social presence, it is unfit for relational communication. So if you have to do difficult things in your virtual team, or basically in every computer-mediated communication conversation, such as decision-making, leadership negotiation, but also emotional conversations, computer-mediated communication is not suitable. You need something richer. You need face-to-face communication, or at least video conferencing. But the theory behind the whole social presence idea, what happens is that they say, well, you need non-verbal cues to regulate interaction. So, for example, turn-taking signals. You see that in Zoom calls, that is often quite difficult because people don't know when the other will stop and the other can, and someone can take over the conversation. While in face-to-face, you have all those non-verbal cues. People looking at you, people looking away. So, for example, turn-taking, regulating the interaction is difficult in computer-mediated communication. You need non-verbal cues to convey individuality. So for example, it helps if you can see someone, you can see the persons you're interacting with. So you need some kind of awareness of others. This is mostly related to social presence. The idea of social presence is psychological awareness of someone else. And finally, they say well, non-verbal cues also enhance context awareness, because non-verbal cues is not only your non-verbal expression and your gestures, but non-verbal cues are also conveyed by what you wear, the room you're in, and other context cues. So, if you are together in a single room, it kind of conveys the idea that you need to do a task together. And you can also miss that in computer-mediated communication, according to these theories. So those are the main functions of non-verbal cues, individuality, social presence, interaction regulation, awareness of context. And if you do not have that, the theories say that leads to de-individuation. And de-individuation is that you have a reduced sense of others, but also a reduced sense of self. So the first one is easy. So if you talk to someone using computer-mediated communication, think of a Reddit or Twitter conversation, you kind of lose the idea that you talk to someone who is actually a real person. So it's easier to, start flaming or start cursing at someone. But the theory also says because of the lack of these non-verbal cues, you also kind of lose a bit of awareness of yourself, because you are also typing away at the computer screen. You have no non-verbal cues of the other. You also know that you are kind of anonymous to the other person as well. And that anonymity may lead to a kind of a loss of sense of self. So, which is related to de-individuation, which means you would do things that you would normally not do when you would be in a face-to-face situation. And this de-individuation caused by a lack of non-verbal cues in its turn leads to everything you see in a Twitter or YouTube conversation. So that leads to disinhibition. Disinhibition is you doing things that you would not normally do, start flaming, negative behavior, resistance to influence. So people cannot convince you so easy because you don't have the feeling that you're communicating with a real person and you are somewhat anonymous. So basically all the things you observe in a Twitter conversation, but it may also have some positive effects. So they say if you want to do like emotional things, build relationships, it's not really possible because of disinhibition and negative behavior. But the flip side of that is that it may also lead to more rationality and more equality, especially in organization settings. So because, for example, if you're in a virtual team or in another relative anonymous setting, like some teams last week also presented a kind of a ID sharing box or knowledge management tools in the organization. Anonymity also makes it easier to speak out. So because your managers and the leadership of an organization cannot see you, so it can also lead to equality and to more attention to arguments instead of emotions, according to these theories. Well, you already see that this is sometimes correct and sometimes is not correct. So, for example, I think you have all experienced the first parts of social presence theory. So that indeed it leads to disinhibition. You know, you saying things you would not normally do, especially other people saying things they would not normally say. Again, if you look at a random YouTube comment section, so you've all experienced the negative behavior. You may all have experienced the flip side of it. So people daring to speak up. But I think this theory does not explain everything, because there are also a lot of situations in which this does not happen, in which online conversations are, you know, can be really emotional and supportive, so not necessarily negative, and also not necessarily rational and equal, which you can also observe from a YouTube comment section. Because if you look at our communication behavior, we can have very emotional conversations in WhatsApp if we want. And also, if you look at the literature, for example, on social support online, there are huge communities in which people provide social support and help each other. But this social presence theory says, well, this is really, basically says this. So communicative cues correspond to communicative functions. So nonverbal cues are used for emotional support, for example, and therefore computer-mediated communication, because they lack those nonverbal cues, cannot perform social functions. So this theory is really direct and strict in its interpretation of what computer-mediated communication can and cannot do. So computer-mediated communication is not suitable for social functions, and thus for difficult types of communication. I think you know from experience that this is not always true. But the theory is really influential nowadays. So it's still the idea that if something resembles face-to-face interaction, it's almost always better than if we use some less rich medium. So it's still highly influential in the organizational literature, and of course sometimes we need face-to-face, but in a moment we will see when not, that face-to-face or richer media may be more suitable. But still there's the general idea, so we need to have more, we need to include more cues, because more cues is more better. And the theory is still influential because, you know, it makes intuitive sense. You know, we are used to face-to-face communication. If we cannot communicate face-to-face, we lack some kind of cues, we lack nonverbal behavior, thus that must make it more difficult to communicate. So it makes intuitive sense. And you see that every couple of years or so, there's increased attention for virtual reality or virtual environments or virtual meeting rooms or whatever. But these almost never take off. So the theory has been debunked. So of course there is some truth in it. So of course this can happen in certain situations. So sometimes computer-mediated communication is not suitable for rich communication. And so sometimes it's suitable, but sometimes it isn't. And to skip a bit forward, it really depends, of course, on the context of the interaction, whether you have social presence related effects or whether computer-mediated communication can actually help in social interaction. Highly influential means that the theory and the ideas derived from the theory influence a lot of research still, and influences what kind of technologies people use in organizations. So that's why we are using Zoom with a camera. That's why we are pushing video conferencing. That's why Facebook is experimenting with virtual worlds in which people can communicate professionally. So it's highly influential because it leads to a lot of because people use the theory in daily life. Welcome. Could you repeat what is meant by communicative functions? Yeah, sure. Communicative functions are things like, emotional content. So what you want to do with communication, do you want to use communication to make an appointment? Do you want to use it to break up? Do you want to use it to have a negotiation with another organization? So the function of communication is negotiating, scheduling, emotional communication. So those are communicative functions. And the theory says, non-verbal cues is negotiation. Non-verbal cues is or is needed for emotional communication. So that is meant by the first sentence. Let's go to the next slide. So a theory, which is also a social presence theory, but a theory that I really want to pick out and discuss more in a minute or so, is media richness, because this one is really influential still and has been a huge influence on the organizational literature and on how organizations deal with technology. So media richness theory is basically the same as social presence. The only thing is that they are a bit more specific about what social presence means and what kind of cues a communication technology needs to offer in order for it to be more rich. And they are the first that relate the richness of communication technology to the function that communication technology affords. So basically they say, there is a match between task and medium. That's what's called contingency. So the usefulness of a communication medium is contingent, depends upon the task. And basically that means they say, higher hyperfocality, which basically means communication that is more difficult. Think emotional communication, think negotiations, think job interviews. So higher hyperfocality, the more difficult communication is, the more rich the communication medium needs to be in order to be able to communicate efficiently. So they classify communication media on a continuum from poor to rich, in which poor media have a low multiplicity of cue systems, which basically means that you can only use text-based chat and you don't have audio or video, or you only have audio but no video. So those are cue systems, text, audio, video, gestures, those kind of things. The availability of immediate feedback is the second dimension. So poor medium have no immediate feedback. They are asynchronous. Rich media provide immediate feedback. They are synchronous. So face-to-face is synchronous because you can talk back and forth. WhatsApp is nearly synchronous because once you press send, the message is directly sent. And email is really asynchronous because it's you can check your email after a couple of days and then only reply a week later or so. Message personalization, so the ability to basically relates to the presence as well, to personalize a message, to tailor it to your to tailor it to what you want to say. You can use emojis, etc. And language variety, which is basically a bit of a more formal aspect of new media. So can you only communicate in a certain fixed way, or do you have more freedom to communicate? And this is not really something that happens in the computer-mediated communication, but think think Twitter. Twitter has a kind of a lower language variety because it only allows a certain number of characters in a message. But in the 80s, this used to be way different. So you could only, for example, communicate using like formal, with really formal language with codes. Think Morse code. No, that's no longer true. Twitter has the messages are longer now, but they're still limited, but they're longer. And they used to be 140 characters, I think. But you're right. But I think Morse code may be the best example of language variety. So you can only communicate using dots and beeps, and while in normal language you have more variety in the language. I think the most important thing to remember is that basically media richness says, well, if you look at what you can do with the communication media, is it synchronous? What kind of queue systems do you have? And some other characteristics, you can kind of classify it in terms of, okay, that is higher bandwidth, that medium is richer than another medium. So that's the most important to remember. And if you kind of put that into a figure, you see that again, face-to-face, of course, is the one that is most rich, at least when the theory was invented. And things like an email and a letter and a text message are lower and poorer. And then they say, well, if you look at the complexity of the information, so if you look at how difficult it is to do the interaction, to convey a message, you get a kind of a band in which you can communicate effectively. So if your complexity of information is low, for example, you want to schedule an appointment or post an announcement on Canvas, then you can use the announcements on Canvas because that is poor interaction, but it's sufficient for what you want to communicate. If you want to communicate something which is rather complex, say a lecture, then you need to have richer communication media. Then you want slides. You want to hear someone. You want maybe to see my non-verbal facial expressions. So then we need richer media. So, and there is a bandwidth. So if we try to communicate something very complex, to do this lecture via an announcement on Canvas, that would be not doable, because then we are in the bottom right of the figure. If I would spend the lecture on explaining when the exam is on the 18th of October, then we would be in the top left of the figure, and we would use a rich medium for communication, which might as well be done with a poorer medium. Yeah, oversimplification means that you oversimplify either the complexity or the richness of the communication medium. So oversimplification means that you're trying. So at the bottom right, oversimplification means that you're trying to put too much information in a too simple communication technology, and on the top left, it means that you're trying to put that you're using a too complex communication technology for a too simple message. So that's what is meant by oversimplification. But I must admit that these are the original terms, but they could have been better. And there is something to this theory. So this theory really was the first one who said, well, okay, those social pressure theories, they are right. But you really have to also think about what you want to use the technology for. So we have a kind of an interaction between the task that you want to accomplish and the communication technology that you use. So this was actually the first theory who said, well, it's not simply richer is better, but it depends on the type of task. But still, of course, they say face-to-face is always the best. Yeah, because the problem with this theory is that it only works in, well, it's not really true. There is something to it, but it mostly works in theory. So if you ask people what would be the best communication technology to break up with someone, and I asked, so what would be the best technology to break up with someone, you would say, well, we definitely need face-to-face. But if you see what people actually use, you see that people often use technologies that, at least according to the theory, are less suitable. So people do not always adhere to the theory. So people often use technologies, communication technologies, for richer types of interaction. Not always successful, but sometimes it is successful. And that is because we choose communication systems not based on optimal efficiency, but based on what we have available and what we want to use. Which basically means that, okay, sometimes we have no choice but to use a WhatsApp interaction. Sometimes we have no choice but to use Microsoft Teams in order to communicate. And if we have no choice, then you see that we are really able to communicate efficiently using theories, which may be technologies which may be classified as poor. Which is basically the next point. So when less choices are available, people generally experience greater closeness. So it's true that if we have all opportunities available in the world, we tend to go for face-to-face interactions for complex communication. But if we lack the ability to use face-to-face or to use video conferencing, we are often perfectly fine in using, text-based chat for our communication. So we have a preference for face-to-face, but we as people are perfectly we are able to adapt to the affordances of a certain communication technology. And that's the main issue with all these present theories. So they say that it's really the technology that determines our interaction, and they don't take into account that we can adapt to a communication technology and we can use a communication technology in the way we see fit. So these theories are rather deterministic. Finally, those dimensions of richness, queue systems, etc., are pretty vague and also not really applicable to current technologies. So especially language variety, you can do that with every communication technology. Immediate feedback, it becomes more synchronous. But nowadays we have more, we have other affordances for communication technology that may make communication technology better than face-to-face. Because with face-to-face, we don't have the visibility that we have with social media. We don't have the editability that we have with social media. So media richness has been invented in like 1984, so it doesn't really take into account any of the affordances of social media. So which basically means that sometimes the social media we use can be more rich in certain terms, in terms of the ability to reach a lot of people than face-to-face interaction. And the theory does not account for that. So you need affordances in order to, you need affordance theory in combination with a kind of media richness theory in order to predict how people may use social media. More about that later on. Okay. Next theory is side model, which is called the social identity model of de-individuation effects. And this actually is already quite an older theory. I think the first paper about it was in 1990. And this theory, I think, is quite interesting to discuss here because it kind of goes, it's kind of counterintuitive at first sight, but I think it makes rather a lot of sense. So this theory takes I'm sorry, they're got a bit distracted because they're working out here in the garden of my apartment complex. Sorry. So what this theory does is that it takes the individuation, but it kind of turns it around. So it says, well, according to social presence, the individuation leads to normlessness. So it leads to, de-individuation, and sorry, it leads to disinhibition and flaming. But they say, well, no, what actually happens is that people behave in accordance to the norms of the online group, but the norms of the online group may be different than what we normally do face to face. So it's not normlessness, it's people behaving according to the identity of the online group. So I'm going to explain it further, but it helps to think of what happens when you game. So if you game in a multiplayer game, especially first-person shooter games, then if you would look at that from an outsider who doesn't play video games, it would really be social presence theory. So you would really say, well, yeah, you see, people are relatively anonymous, so they have an avatar, they cannot be connected to their own self, so it's pretty anonymous. And indeed, it is really de-individuated and disinhibited behavior. So people curse, they tell what they would do to other people's mother, so they flame. So from an outsider perspective, conversations in multiplayer games will be really, can someone else explain what flaming is? Those multiplayer games will be really disinhibited. So it will really be social presence theory. But if you're in such a game and you're actually a player, then you would say, no, this is not de-individuated and disinhibited at all. This is what we do when we play online games. This is part of our identity as a gamer. Thanks, Saskia. Correct. So it's our identity as a gamer to behave to behave as such. So it's actually not normlessness. It's actually not de-individuated, but it's actually our identity as a gamer. And that is what side theory basically argues. So side theory says, well, the individuation is not simply a lack of awareness of others, which cause you to flame, insult people, but it kind of relates to you going with the identity of the group that you're in. So that's what's called normlessness. So, but I explain it, it's explained better on the next slide. So they say, well, when you're anonymous, you're not normlessness, but you're more responsive to the social situation of the group. So they say when you're anonymous in a crowd, your identity can shift from a personal identity to a social identity, leading to a strong identification with the norms of the group that you're in. Also still pretty vague. But what that means is that when you are relatively anonymous and you're in a certain group, you have some of these effects of social presence. So you kind of have a lack of awareness of others. You also feel kind of anonymous, and because of that anonymity, and because you have less cues available, and so you don't know exactly who you're interacting with, you are searching for cues in the interaction to establish a certain norm, so to know who you're dealing with. And if then you find common ground with the people you're in, you will form a group. So you will create a shared identity. So for gaming, this basically means you're relatively anonymous when you game. So you know you're relatively anonymous yourself. You know the other people you communicate with are also relatively anonymous. but you know that you all played a video game. As a result, you feel, and that they are part of your group or party. And as a result, you feel connected to those people because you think, okay, I don't know them. I don't know if the person actually looks like me or is completely different than me, but I do know that this person is part of my group. So that is what you base your whole impression on of that other person. So this theory argues that if you are in an anonymous situation, but you know that you are interacting with people with a common identity, they're all gamers, they're all playing the same game, they're all students at Tilburg University, whatever, then you feel really strongly connected to the group, even more strongly connected than in face-to-face situations. Because in face-to-face situations, yeah, it's related to groupthink. Because in face-to-face situations, you can also feel connected to a group, but you have also individuating information. So in face-to-face situations, you feel connected to a group, but you can still say, well, I don't like this person because he or she is wearing completely different clothes than I am, or his nonverbal behavior is different. But in an anonymous situation, the only thing you have sometimes is that the group is your group, and then you really identify very strongly with that group. So it's related to a sort of groupthink indeed. So you start behaving in accordance to the group norms, but the theory, so it's kind of groupthink, and what the theory adds is that effects are stronger in online communication because of the anonymity than they are in face-to-face interactions. So now let me get back to the previous slides. So the individuation theory would say people are like normless because they feel less presence, they feel anonymous, and that can lead to flaming and disinhibited behavior. They say, well, it's not normlessness, but because you are anonymous and the other people are also anonymous, you are more responsive to the situational norm of the group that you belong to. So you are looking for, okay, is this group similar to me or not? So it basically means that if the group resembles a group that you're also part of, a group that you like, you feel strongly connected to that group. So it becomes part of your social identity, which in turn leads to a identification with that group. And this is an example of a study based on site theory. In which you had a 2-by-2 design, a depersonalized versus an individuated condition in which people were either completely anonymous or they saw each other's name and picture when they communicated online. And the other condition was that either people were part of the same group or they were part of different groups. And in this case, it was university students. So this study was done at the University of Amsterdam, and students from communication in University of Amsterdam, they think they're kind of full of themselves. So they think, oh, we are students of the University of Amsterdam, we do communication, we're really cool. So they have a shared identity. And in the other, and then you had an interpersonal condition in which you saw the, so in which you had if you had a little shared identity. And the interesting thing is that if people were communicating with students from their, at least with people who they thought were also communication students from the University of Amsterdam, but when they were, and they were anonymous, they felt really connected to their fellow students. So the measure here is polarization. So they really, which basically, so they had they were asked a certain opinion, and afterwards their opinion became much stronger and much more group focused, which is an indicator of a social identity. So they really formed a coherent social identity when they were anonymous and when they thought they were part of the same group. When they were not anonymous and part of the same group, that kind of switched around, because then they thought from, oh, well, okay, we're all students from communication, but I don't really like you because you are not the right sex. You don't look as good as I do, or whatever. So there were all kinds of individual variables involved that made the social identity less relevant. And you kind of could observe the opposite effect for the other group. So when students thought they were interacting with an out group, they really disliked the group when they were anonymous. But when they're not anonymous, they could see from, well, those people are, they're also students. So they would pay more attention to the individual information. So basically what this means is that if you are, that social presence theory is not entirely correct because it's not normlessness, but it's more that we if we are in a relatively anonymous situation, we tend to pay attention to what we have in common. So because we are less sure about others, we tend to pay more attention to what connects us. And I will explain this even more when discussing the next theory. So when we observe this in a lot of studies, so when people indeed are really anonymous in computer-mediated communication, but there is a common ground. So for example, they have to achieve a common task. They know they're part of the same virtual team. You usually see that people can get along very well in virtual teams. So they really feel like they're part of the in-group. They also dislike out-groups. So there's kind of stereotyping going on. But you see that if people are relatively anonymous, but if they do have a common ground, they really can get along well together, even better sometimes than face-to-face. The problem with this theory is that it really hinges upon anonymity. And but what you, of course, observe nowadays in computer-mediated communication is that it's less and less completely anonymous. So we always have some information about other people. So while this theory was hugely popular in the 90s, there has been less attention to the theory now. But in the next lecture, knowledge management, we see that attention to a shared identity may really be beneficial if you want people in organizations to work together. So this theory will be discussed more in the next lecture when we talk about knowledge management. So individuated indeed is being more aware of yourself and others, and de-individuated means that you're a bit less aware of yourself because you also feel anonymous and also less aware of others. Yes. But I can explain it better with this next theory. Shall we have a short break first, like say 10 minutes or so, and then we continue? I gather that no response means a yes. So let's have a break and then let's continue in 10 minutes and get a cup of coffee. So, okay, let's continue. There is one question, are there any time slots for Friday? I'm not sure Joost is still here in this conversation. But yeah, okay. Okay, thanks Joost. Was not sure if you were still here. So then I can continue with the lecture. So the next theory is social information processing, and this is a rather simple theory, and it's also still hugely influential. So Joe Walther has developed two theories of communication, which I think are which are the most influential theories we have as of yet of computer-mediated communication. And the first one is social information processing theory. And this was really the first theory that went further than simply saying, well, face-to-face is always better because you lack those cues. So this was the first theory that said, well, no, we can also, online communication can be just as rich as face-to-face interaction. So this theory is, it's very simply explained. So the theory also says, well, indeed, you're right. So compared to face-to-face, when we're communicating online, you lack bandwidth. So you lack nonverbal cues, the communication may be less synchronous, etc. Which basically means that it takes long, but instead of simply saying, well, because you have like less presence and less bandwidth, it's not that such a technology is inherently bad. He says, well, it just takes longer in order to develop meaningful relationships, in order to communicate efficiently, which kind of makes sense as well, of course. So he says people really are motivated to reduce uncertainty, to develop impressions of one another. And usually, especially in organizational settings, people also are motivated to develop a certain kind of affinity. So there are relatively few people who like to be disliked. Most of us want to get along with others. So he says, well, there is a kind of a lack of bandwidth, but it's not that people simply then stop trying and saying, well, nothing to do except flaming and cursing at people. He says, no, people are motivated to form impressions of others, because people want to reduce uncertainty and form impressions of each other, and they want to develop a certain affinity for the group they're in. But because we have less information available in computer-mediated communication in face-to-face, it simply takes longer. So it takes a bit longer to develop relationship to develop, and we have to rely on the cues that we have available. So simply put, if we can only communicate via text-based communication, via WhatsApp conversation, we rely more on the cues that we have available there. So this theory basically says, well, we can communicate as rich as face-to-face, but because we want to reduce uncertainty, we take into account all the information we have at our disposal in order to form an impression of other people. And this may explain all the previous theories. So for example, if you're in an online anonymous setting and you don't know how to behave, and the only thing you see is that people curse at each other, then you think, oh well, that must be what's normal here, and then you start behaving as such. So if you are relatively anonymous in a computer-mediated communication setting, but the only thing you can observe is, these people are part of my own group, then you will feel attached to the group. So this theory kind of explains most of what the other theories also pose. So specifically, the theory says, well, people adapt their interpersonal communication, and they adapt the way they form impressions based on whatever cues remain available in computer-mediated communication. So think a WhatsApp conversation. So we have no so we have no video there. Well, we can, of course, but in a WhatsApp text-based conversation. So what we do is, so we develop other types of cues, and we develop other ways in order to communicate. So, for example, we pay more attention to linguistic cues, to know if people make spelling errors or not. We pay attention to chronemics. You all know that if you're in a WhatsApp conversation with someone, and then you see person is typing and then nothing happens, you get really annoyed, and you start thinking about, what must that mean? Is he or she thinking along about the answer? Am I not good anymore? Good enough anymore? So you start thinking, you're going to come up with all situations why that happens. Similar to, if someone says hi with one eye, or hi with 20 eyes, also has different meaning. So we tend to use all the available cues, everything we have to our disposal. We tend to use that in order to form impressions. Yeah, and then I receive. Okay, yeah, yeah. And it's kind of interesting because it's of course, one of the criticisms of this theory as well is that this theory is also really deterministic. So, but it really depends on the group that you're in and the person you're communicating with, what is okay and to what extent you can communicate well, of course. So it depends on the group and the people you're with. So this basically means that people develop alternative strategies that substitute for those used in face-to-face. So we pay more attention to, for example, emojis because we lack video and computer-mediated communication. But you also see that people use other strategies. So people, they let me first answer the question by Ferdinand. Do you have an example of a visual cue, or would that be seeing someone typing? Well, a visual cue is you know, an image that you can use in WhatsApp. Or someone's profile picture in WhatsApp. So that's a visual cue. Or if you Google someone and you find pictures of him or her beforehand. So those are all kinds of visual cues. It's not really, of course, emojis are basically also visual cues, of course, but I wanted to specifically state emojis because that's really a substitute for non-verbal behavior. But people also use strategies themselves in order to reduce that uncertainty. So you see that in computer-mediated communication, or gives him WhatsApp. In computer-mediated communication, people also ask more questions. So this is the research I do mostly. So, for example, I have a PhD student, she's just about finished, who studied language use in online dating. And in our studies, we indeed found that people pay a lot of attention. Well, people for whom it's important pay a lot of attention to spelling and language use in online dating profiles, and that determines in part whether you like someone or not. So, for example, if you see someone making a lot of typos, you think that person is sloppy, and you may like the person less. If someone is making a lot of grammatical errors in an online dating profile, you think that person is less intelligent, and you may like the person less. So we basically tend to use all the cues we have available. So a lot of spelling errors must be a sloppy person or less conscientious. So we basically use all the information we have to form impressions. In another study that we did already quite a while ago, we had people communicate with each other who did not know each other for the first time. And the task was you have to get to know each other. And people were like either had to communicate via text-based chat or communicated face-to-face. And what we observed was that the people who communicated via text-based chat, their conversations were much, much more intimate than people communicating face-to-face. So in face-to-face, people mostly communicated about, you know, what they studied, what kind of work they did, maybe where they lived, but that was about it. But in the text-based chat conditions, people communicated on a much more intimate level. You know, they communicated about love, about relationships, more about intimate topics. And we found out that was because people asked each other a lot more questions than in the face-to-face condition. And our explanation is that is because people could not see each other. So they were completely anonymous, they did not know each other. In face-to-face situations, you have a lot of information, so you know what someone looks like, so you can form an impression relatively quickly. But in an anonymous situation online, the only thing that you can do is ask questions. And asking questions is and getting answers and develop conversation is the best way to get to know and get to like someone else. So we also use different strategies in computer-mediated communication compared to face-to-face. So that's basically what. Yeah, so you ask questions in order to reduce uncertainty because you have no other cues. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, if you only can see someone, you have a lot of stereotypes going on. So you see, okay, is someone attractive or not that attractive? Can I classify that person in a certain subculture? Is he more like a hipster or a nerd or whatever? But if you have no information, the only thing you can do is ask questions. Yeah. And that's kind of a robust finding, by the way. It's kind of interesting that in by far the most research that has been done in which you have let people who don't know each other beforehand interact and have them get to know each other. People like each other more afterwards when they use computer-mediated communication than when they use face-to-face. So it may seem obvious that in a virtual team that you want the people to meet face-to-face for the first time, but actually that's not always necessary. It's also possible, to give them a task and say get to know each other using the chat function in Microsoft Teams. That works just as well. Only, of course, you also you want to build trust, and you want to create a shared identity, and that may be more useful face-to-face. But in order to get the people to know and to like each other, you don't necessarily need face-to-face contact. Yeah, this paper kind of explains social information processing and puts it into and tests it experimentally. It's not that interesting anymore now that I explained social information processing, but I think it's kind of a nice paper because because you see that this theory also plays a role in explaining communication with even with chatbots. So if a chatbot is quick to reply, and if a chatbot is contingent upon upon the question, so if a chatbot actually replies to your question instead of a generic response, then we are satisfied with the chat. And then basically, because then we think, okay, the chatbot must be really responsive and must be a good chatbot. So those are the cues we go on. But you see that if the chatbot is slow, or if the chatbot replies quickly but provides a generic answer, we immediately stereotype the chatbot in terms of, okay, that chatbot is just a machine. So we also use those heuristics, those quick ways to judge someone or something. In this case, we also use it in chatbot conversations. So basically, social information processing theory says, well, we rely on the cues that we have available, and if we have relatively few cues available, we base our entire impression of that person or whatever on the cues that we have available. So we use what we have. So there's some criticism in this theory, of which the second one, I think, may vary in their motivations, is the least interesting, because of course people may have different motivations that affect the outcome. What I think is interesting is the first one. So that originally social information processing only said, well, it takes longer to get to know each other because you have less bandwidth. But it turns out that if you say to people, you are part of a virtual team and you have to work with each other during the coming months, if you say that in the first meeting, then people will immediately form some kind of bond. So if you don't say that to people, it indeed turns out that it takes quite a while before they feel part of the same team. But if you say that they have to work with each other in the first meeting, people immediately feel part of the same team. And that is because there is kind of anticipation of future interaction. Okay, apparently we have to work with the same group of people. So then people immediately start to look for what the team has in common. They immediately start to reduce uncertainty. So basically, the original idea, let me go back a couple of slides. The original idea that takes longer to develop is sometimes still relevant, but not always. But the increased reliance on the available channels, so people use whatever information they have, that is now really the main focal point of social information processing theory. And the final point here is that sometimes impressions are not similar but go beyond. That's also something that social information processing theory cannot explain well. So you see that sometimes in when people have to communicate anonymously, they even feel more part of the same group. So they even feel more connected than they do face-to-face. So that's what side theory also explains. They say, well, if you're anonymous and the only thing you have is that you feel part of a group, then you feel more part of the group than if you were not anonymous. But social information processing still says that, well, face-to-face is still the best, impression face-to-face, but face-to-face cannot be better. Sorry, nothing can be better than face-to-face. And that is the final point is the main reason that Walther, next to social information processing theory, developed what is called the hyper-personal model of computer-mediated communication. And this is based on, this is kind of an integration of social information processing and the site model, in which he tries to explain how computer-mediated communication sometimes is, even more intimate, or people feel even more connected than face-to-face. So hyperpersonal stems from the observation that sometimes people develop even more intimate social relationships with each other, in virtual teams or interpersonal, than they would offline do. And Walther explains this using the basic communication model, so the sender-receiver channel feedback. And he says each of these aspects of the communication process are different when you use computer-mediated communication than when you're face-to-face, and all can contribute to a kind of a hyper-personal effect in which communication can be more intimate, so even better than face-to-face interaction. So let me explain that first. So he says, well, let me start with the sender perspective. No, let me start. No, I'll do the receiver perspective. So he says, well, from a receiver perspective, you have everything that is explained by social information processing and site theory. So from the receiver's point of view, you have less information available about the other person. So you tend to use every cue that you have at your disposal to form an impression of the other person or persons. And if that is something that you like, so if it is something positive, so that the other people are part of your team, then you tend to form stereotypical, positively biased attributions of the others. So basically, I only know that a person asks me questions, so that person must like me, or I only know that that group of persons is part of my team, so I must like them because of that. So those are positively biased attributions because you have limited information available and you use the information that you have. So that's from a sender perspective. So he argues from a from a receiver perspective. So he argues from a sender perspective, well, people can selectively present themselves. So on a dating website, you can selectively craft your personal profile, but you also can do so on LinkedIn and also on your internal profile page on Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever enterprise social media you use. So you can be selective in how you present yourself. Well, this is kind of obvious, of course, and we also try to be selective in how we present ourselves online on Instagram or dating sites, TikTok, whatever. And we also do that professionally. And of course, that creates a kind of a feedback loop, the last point. So the sender presents his or herself selectively, the receiver only has that information to go on and forms a positive impression. And the sender then thinks, oh, well, the person has a positive impression of me. And that's kind of a feedback loop in which a relation can become, in which you can have a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's the feedback loop. And then finally, the channel. Of course, computer-mediated communication, everything allows for greater control and easier self-presentation. So the channel we use in computer-mediated communication offers affordances that make it possible for us to present ourselves in a certain way. So you can craft your LinkedIn profile, you can spend a lot of attention to the pictures you choose to post on your Instagram profile. So we have a greater control in how we present ourselves. So even here in our conversation, I can be, selective in how I present myself. I can pick an intelligent-looking book and just, try to present myself as an intellectual. I can even touch up my profile in Zoom. So I can be kind of selective in, you can touch up your appearance. I don't know if you can see that, but Zoom can make me more or less pretty. I think in my case, it may be a hopeless cause, but you can touch up your appearance in Zoom. So you can be, you have greater control. And basically all those four effects, so sender, receiver, channel, feedback effects, they make it so that sometimes online communication can be more intimate, so you can be more satisfied, can have a greater feeling of feeling part of a team than you could do offline. But of course, this is not always the case. So this is a kind of ideal situation, and Walther also, most attention is given in this theory to like positive effects, but hyper-personal can also be hyper-negative, because if those first impressions are negative, if the sender presents him or herself in a way that is that the receiver does not find positive, then that can lead to a negative spiral. So if you are in a virtual team and the first meeting does not really go well, or you have the wrong information about each other, or you simply don't like the way the other people behave or look, then that could lead to a negative spiral as well. So most attention in this theory has been devoted to hyper-positive effects, but the effects might as well be hyper-negative depending on the first instances of a conversation. So the one of the other papers here I think is quite interesting, because there they say, well, we can kind of combine the hyperpersonal theory with social information processing and other theories, and they explain from, well, there should be some kind of optimum. So because if you because people tend to form kind of hyper-personal effects when they have less cues available. But also, if you have too few cues available, that may lead to reduced social presence, because you need to have like a minimal amount of cues available in order to be able to form an impression. So they present what they call the electronic portrayal continuum, in which they say, well, there's a kind of a hyper-personal optimum in which you should have not have too few cues, because then you have reduced social presence. You should not have too much cues, because then you can have no hyper-personal effects. But if you go somewhere in between, then you reach a hyper-personal optimum. And people, so in this case, they investigated trust in virtual teams. So there's a kind of an optimum in which you create optimal trust in virtual teams. And I thought that was a really interesting take on combining the different theories. And I think there is something to it. So you don't want to give no information, but also you want that kind to stimulate online interactions in order for the hyper-personal effects to do their work. So I thought that was quite interesting. I'll skip this, just an explanation of the paper. So in sum, if you look at all the computer-mediated communication theories, they all kind of have face-to-face as a benchmark, and they focus on certain cues that are available in face-to-face that are not available in computer-mediated communication. And basically all their effects that they predict are based on that, on that viewpoint, so on the cues that you have available or not, face-to-face or in other communication technologies. But they do say that apart from social presence, it really depends on the task, the context, and the users to what extent you observe certain effects of online communication. So hyperpersonal and side model argues, okay, it really depends on the group that you're in, if you feel part of the group online or not. And media richness theory says, well, it depends on the type of task you do, what communication technology is most efficient. So I think these theories are, very interesting to tell us something about how people communicate in organizations, in virtual teams. And also that they kind of teach us that it's not necessarily always the best to use face-to-face, and that even if you think so, there are ways to compensate for the lack of face-to-face interaction by strategically, creating a shared identity, by having people communicate with certain types of technology, by having them to introduce each other, so that you can create kind of hyper-personal, or so that you can so that people can form an impression based on the cues that are available, etc. So based on these theories, you kind of have a lot of different, you can derive a lot of different tactics to use strategically in virtual team settings in organizations. And I have a couple of examples coming up now. All theories still face-to-face as benchmark. Mostly they are developed in a time when people communicated text-based, and there is no focus on multimodality and underlying mechanisms. So basically all these points, except for the first one, relate to that, okay, maybe we should look at the affordances. So maybe we should go beyond, okay, we have less bandwidth available, and look at the things that we can do with technologies that we cannot do face-to-face. So for example, multimodality, which relates to visibility of interactions, is that that what we do now is in some respects even richer than face-to-face. You can hear me, you can see me, but we also share the PowerPoint slides, and there is a chat function available in which you can ask questions. So in certain ways, what we do now is richer than face-to-face interaction. And basically those theories, those computer-mediated communication theories, do not handle that well. I think affordances, so focusing more not only on, well, we can explain it here. So CMC theories tend to focus on, reduced cues, controllability and chronemics, time-based aspects of online communication, on social presence and on the interaction itself. So they basically focus on these. Well, these. Why do I point? So theories of computer-mediated communication focus on these four that you see on screen here. So they focus really on communicative aspects of communication technologies, while what we have learned before in social media focus on affordances that go beyond face-to-face interaction, visibility, persistence, etc. But I do think that you can classify all these 8 aspects here as affordances. So affordances of social media can be classified among visibility, persistence, etc. And affordances of computer-mediated communication are reduced cues, controllability over the interaction, some kind of presence that you have or not, and the communicative cues you have. So I think these can also be seen as affordances. And these interact with, the context, the task, the user, what we learned in the first lecture now about social materiality, and together they explain consequences of computer-mediated communication. But we can continue this now in our meeting on virtual teams. Where the heck is the thing? Here? No, not here. Here. I'm so happy that I really got a lot of information about lecture 4 and 5. So that's at the end of the next lecture, we really finish with everything. Because in the remainder of this lecture, I want to explain 2 things about virtual teams, which kind of come back to all the affordances we just talked about, to the affordances of computer-mediated communication. No. So in the remainder of the lecture, I want to talk about virtual teams, which kind of come back to these 4 affordances of computer-mediated communication and the affordances of social media. So because if you look at what virtual teams can offer in organizations and how virtual teams function in organizations, it's really a function of all those affordances and of those virtual teams. So virtual teams, they differ in how they can communicate. They all use communication technologies that go beyond face-to-face interaction, that are visible and persistent, etc. So all these affordances, again, we see in our discussion of virtual teams. But first, here they are. Let's define a virtual team. So if you see the definition of virtual teams, it's a group of people that work together on a common task independent of geographical and temporal boundaries, supported by ICT, or people who predominantly use technology. There is some kind of a commonality in virtual teams, but the types of virtual teams are widely different. So I think I can better show it with this slide first. Because there are several types of virtualness. So, for example, the team, the subgroup that you're in for this course, in which you write, in which you do the assignments, so assignment 1 and 2, that is a virtual team. but you can still meet each other face to face. So a virtual team does not mean that you cannot meet each other face to face at all. But it is to some extent virtual, because the work you do is mediated by technology. So if you look at the types of virtual teams, I think this is a useful figure. So this classifies it into 3 dimensions. So it says, well, you can have a team that is really spends 100% of its time together physically, or that is never together. Well, it's not necessarily physical, but you always work together, or you never work together at the same time. So the percentage of time apart on a task. So even if you are, if the physical distance is very close, then even you can be a virtual team, because the work you do is just does not take place at the same time necessarily. So of course you can have virtualness in terms of physical distance. So the farther you are, further you are, the more virtual you are. But also the level of technology support determines how virtual you are. So you can be a virtual team which says, well, we meet once a week face to face, and in the meantime we do our own business and then we meet again. Or you can use all kinds of technologies, Google Docs, Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, Office 365, in order to do your work. So basically what this means is that there are multiple dimensions that determine the extent to which teams are virtual. So first of all, one dimension is that they are not necessarily restrained to a physical location. So that's, of course, what we think that virtual means when we tend to think of virtual teams in the beginning, but that's only one dimension. So not constrained to a physical location. The second dimension is virtual teams are not constrained to a specific time. So they're asynchronous. Another dimension of virtual teams is that they can vary in the extent to which team members work on tasks separately. So some teams really have to get together and work. They have to brainstorm, they have to develop creative ideas, they have to do like physical work together. But other teams can work on tasks separately. You write chapter 1, you write chapter 2, you write chapter 3. Teams also differ in the terms that to which their composition varies. Are the teams kind of closed, or are they more fluid and open? So is it a team in which the members vary? So for this meeting, we fly in virtually or physically someone, and then he takes part in this meeting, but not in the other meetings. So the fluidness of the membership of a virtual team. So all of these are dimensions of the virtualness of a team. But I think, well, not only I, but generally, what is most important is that a virtual team is always mediated by technology to a certain extent. So you use Google Docs to write the paper, you use Zoom to communicate. So there's always some kind of communication technology or other supportive technology involved in virtual teams. So a virtual team is a small group working together on a common task, partially mediated or fully by communication technology. So that is the definition of a virtual team. Then I'm going to discuss the pros and cons on the next time, because I want to do this, discuss this. Oh yeah, what if you always meet offline but work via docs? Is that a traditional or a hybrid team? Well, that's partly virtual, so that's a hybrid team. So if you always meet offline, but in the meantime, you work together asynchronously via Google Docs, which is, I think, how many teams nowadays work, then you're part virtual, because because you do a lot of your work mediated by technology, but also because you still have to deal, or you can still profit from all the affordances of online interaction. So, for example, if you work together via docs, it's editable and it's persistent. So you have a history of who worked on what, and also you have all those communication affordances in a team like that. So, for example, if you work together via docs, and you see what your fellow teammate has been working on in the meantime. So, for example, if he or she has not done a lot of work, you may use that information as a cue for, well, see, he has not put in the work he should have, so he must be lazy. But that could be a hyper-personal effect. It might as well be that person has some kind of personal issues or is sick or something like that. So even if you meet offline, then in the meantime you have all these. You are subject to all these effects that virtual teams may have. So, in sum, yes, if you meet offline with work via docs, it's partly virtual, so it's a hybrid team. Okay, I want to because this slide is rather important for the next meeting as well. So I want to discuss this slide because I also think it's very practically relevant. There is a theory, it's from 1998, so pretty old, which says if you look at technology that supports teams and that supports all types of teams, all types of hybrid teams, you see that there are three functions of that technology. So what technology does in supporting virtual teams is, first of all, they offer information processing abilities. So this is what Google Docs do. So they offer you shared document system. They offer you to share notes. They offer you a common work area like they do in Microsoft Teams, or like you can do in your group in Canvas. And you use that to convey task-related information. So I think that's easy to understand. So what technology does to support a team first is they offer all kinds of tools in order for you to share documents, work with each other, everything you need to do to convey, to communicate task-related information. The second thing they do is they offer process structuring. So they offer the ability to coordinate. So in Teams, or not necessarily Teams with all the Office suite, but also in Slack, you can make a project planning. You can plan meetings, you can coordinate who does what when, which is all related to coordination, so process structuring. And finally, technology offers communication support. That is what we talked about this whole lecture. So they offer chat, discussion board, email functionality, video conferencing abilities, one-on-one conferencing abilities, etc. So communication support. And these three these three abilities are basically built into every aspect of into every technology that we have. So if you look at, for example, Clarion or Teams or Slack, all enterprise social media systems, and if you look at the abilities, then you see that always these three pop up. So they, all the technologies we have really have listened very well to the theory, and they all have kind of developed a system which offers all these three abilities. So these images link to descriptions of these technologies. And if you have time available, you should click on them, because you see that exactly what they described really fits nicely into each of these three categories. So this is what we continue further, also related to knowledge management. These three functionalities of virtual teams really affect how teams function. And that is what we will discuss next week in the continuing of virtual teams and knowledge management. So for now, thank you very much. And Joost will do the meetings on Thursday. I will not be here on Thursday. So I will see you next week. So for now, thank you very much. And good luck on Thursday, and I'll see you next week. I'm going to